brings new meaning, new hope, and new way. Such is the blessing bestowed upon us. Every hardship and heartache will pass. From the mountains to the deep blue sea, everything in perfect harmony. And as the stars fill the evening sky, without a sensing, life is passing by. So if you want it, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We'd like to welcome you to the program Raising Children, the Islamic awareness program on raising children. And we have with us in the studio today Dr. Hakeem Rasheed. Assalamu alaikum, Doctor.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Now, there is a problem, isn't there, with a lot of children, especially Muslim children, that the parents feel it might be better to educate them at home rather to send them out to the state school where they meet all kinds of people.
Right.
There's a problem here. I just like to say that sometimes parents argue when the children are small that all we need to teach them is ABC and 1, 2, 3 and 2 and 2 is 4, and it's very easy. We'd like to have your opinion on this, homeschooling versus state schooling. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think first of all, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think we have to look at the in a sense, the meaning of education, and keep that in mind as we talk about education for Muslim children. What is the purpose of education? How do we as Muslims actualize that purpose? And I think if we look at education as a way of a culture perpetuating itself, you know, we can talk about instruction, we can talk about philosophy of education, we can talk about education versus training, if you will, schooling versus training. But ultimately, the purpose of education is to help a culture, a society, perpetuate itself from one generation to the next. That's what educational institutions do. You know, so that is their purpose. So if we look at non-Muslim educational institutions, their purpose is to help perpetuate whatever non-Muslim culture that they're involved in. Just as for Islamic schools, the Islamic school should perpetuate the Islamic culture. So I have to admit that I am a strong advocate of Islamic schools for Muslim children. But there are those times where that may not be a possibility, and it just may not be pragmatic.
May not be affordable.
Or affordable. For certainly economics is a pragmatic issue.
Just like to say here, Doctor, sorry to jump in, but this is a problem even here in the Middle East.
Sure.
That the international schools, as they're called, international schools, are mostly staffed by non-Muslims, especially the English medium ones.
Right.
And they perpetuate a kind of anti-Islamic culture.
Well,
actually.
absolutely.
Without attacking Islam directly, of course.
Sure. Well, they're not promoting Islam in Muslim children.
They're not.
So therefore, the children are getting a non-Muslim cultural context in the school by default.
It's beginning to have a big effect on society.
Yeah. And I think that it's a responsibility that Muslims are going to have to really, begin to address head on, and Muslims with resources are going to have to really make some serious decisions about how to allocate those resources for the rest of the Muslim ummah. We've got a situation, I know, in the United States where probably 90% of Muslim children are in non-Muslim school. Well, that begins to have an effect over time in terms of the perpetuation of Islam from one generation to the next. Because ultimately, children go into non-Muslim school situations early. They become absorbed into a non-Muslim peer group. So by, and this is, within, virtually any group of children by the age of 8, 9, 10 years old, they're absorbed into their peer group. Their peer group becomes much more important in terms of influencing them even in the family.
Yes, that's
And they
right.
begin to manifest those non-Muslim values, beliefs,
And you get
and
these home
ideals.
clashes, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think that what we see then is a lot of Muslims trying to protect their children by keeping their children at home as long as possible if they cannot afford to send them into an Islamic school situation. I think that's an admirable choice. But
But is it a viable one?
ultimately, it becomes very difficult because at a certain point, you've got to deal with how, is that parent or is that set of parents, are they able to marshal the kinds of resources that are necessary to give that child the kind of quality education they're going to need in order to function in society? In other words, the kind of university preparation or preparation in terms of a trade, something that's going to help them make that transition into adulthood. So you see, it is a lot easier at the younger ages because the parents know a lot more than the children, and they're able to give them what they know.
The basics.
But the basics. But what happens when it's time to teach algebra, when it's time to teach chemistry and physics and those kinds of things, it becomes problematic at that point. So I think that, again, the best solution is Islamic schools, but we're nowhere near a situation now where that's a viable solution for all Muslim children.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. There's another view, and it's one that I've been very impressed with. That I remember when I was in Pakistan many years ago, I went with my host to a garage to see the mechanic. And the mechanic had working with him two boys, not his sons, 11 and 12 years old, covered in oil, They weren't at school, they'd been with him for 4 years, and they knew some basic mechanics. And he said, by the time they're 20, they'll be experts, they'll have a living. And I thought to myself, so many children in England, for example, are forced to go to school till they're 16, and they're really not doing any good for themselves in it. And only the teachers become a kind of babysitter, doctor, keeping them off the streets. They're learning the absolute ablative and this grammatical points, and it's of no use to them at all. Better that they would have the old system, we used to call it apprenticeship,
Well, that's true, although some would argue that becomes a tracking system in and of itself, because you end up tracking the children early into a career that perhaps that child might be a good mechanic, but he might have been a better engineer. But the whole idea of engineering has been cut off for him because his schooling has been cut off. Right. Much of the problem that we see in educational institutions is their failure to motivate children to learn. And it's not so much an intrinsic problem on the part of children. We have to really look at what children are bringing to the table in terms of their abilities and their interests. Children are naturally curious, which means that they're naturally motivated. You place a 1 or 2 year old in this room, and they're going to find something to get into. They're going to find something to learn, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the child as a sponge for knowledge. Now, that at a certain point, that process begins to get stifled by the nature of the educational system. Not the child. The child doesn't change, but the nature of the educational system changes, and it becomes one focused on rote memory and other kinds of things.
Right. We're coming up for a commercial break now. Inshallah, we'll be back on this subject.
All right, inshallah.
We're going to take a break. You're watching Raising Children, the Islamic program about children's issues, and we'll be back in a few minutes after the break. Assalamu alaikum.
Like every sunrise that brings forth each day.
Welcome back. You're watching Raising Children, and we're talking to our guest, Dr. Hakeem Rasheed. Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Alaikum salam.
There's another view, and it's one that I've been very impressed with. That I remember when I was in Pakistan many years ago, I went with my host to a garage to see the mechanic. And the mechanic had working with him two boys, not his sons, 11 and 12 years old, covered in oil, you know. They weren't at school. They'd been with him for 4 years, and they knew some basic mechanics. And he said, you know, by the time they're 20, they'll be experts. They'll have a living. And I thought to myself, you know, so many children in England, for example, are forced to go to school till they're 16, and they're really not doing any good for themselves in it. And only the teachers become a kind of babysitter, doctor. You know, keeping them off the streets. They're learning the absolute ablative and this grammatical points, and it's of no use to them at all. Better that they would have the old system, we used to call it apprenticeship. You know?
Well, that's true, although some would argue that becomes a tracking system in and of itself, because you end up tracking the children early into a career that perhaps that child might be a good mechanic, but he might have been a better engineer. But the whole idea of engineering has been cut off for him because his schooling has been cut off. Right. You know, I mean, much of the problem that we see in educational institutions is their failure to motivate children to learn. You know, and it's not so much an intrinsic problem on the part of children. We have to really look at what children are bringing to the table in terms of their abilities and their interests. Children are naturally curious, which means that they're naturally motivated. You place a 1 or 2 year old in this room, and they're going to find something to get into. You know, they're going to find something to learn, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the child as a sponge for knowledge. Now, that at a certain point, that process begins to get stifled by the nature of the educational system. Not the child. The child doesn't change, but the nature of the educational system changes, and it becomes one focused on rote memory and other kinds of things.
Right. We were discussing the homeschooling versus state schooling issue, and I'd just like to put one point to you, that perhaps if Muslims banded together a bit, they could do at least the elementary schooling much better, you know, that it isn't just one parent doing it every day.
Right.
They could help each other out, bring their children together. And have you seen any examples of this?
We've seen examples of this. We see in the United States, for example, we have some Muslim homeschool networks, for example. So the parents will come together and they will do small group instruction with children. They'll draw on the strengths of parents. They'll bring people from the community in to do certain kinds of instruction. They'll create sports programs for the kids, you know, because there's a recognition that they have to have some extracurricular activities. So there is a precedent for that. I think we see that growing more and more, and I certainly think it's a viable option.
I think the movement in the States must be some 30 years old now, at least.
It's been around for a while. I mean, my children are now 30, 26, and almost 21, and people were homeschooling when my children were in school, you know, 20, 25 years ago.
You chose to send your children to the state schools?
Actually, we chose to send our children to, particularly our oldest children, to Muslim schools.
I see.
We saw that as the only option for us. We did not want to send them to the state schools because of all the things that we've talked about.
The bad habits that they pick up.
Right. And so we were fortunate enough to be able to find quality Islamic schools in our area to send them to. And it worked out well. You know, my son ended up going to a private school later in his academic career, and you know, the jury's still out in terms of, I think, his development, but I think it was good academically, but it had some challenges in terms of him maintaining his Islamic identity. So that's, you know, there's a trade-off there. We see this happening in a lot of situations. You know, but there's a lot of variety because children are different. Yeah. You know, children have their own personalities, and that's one of the things that parents have to really recognize, is that they have to recognize their personalities as well as their own children's personalities as they even get involved in the whole homeschool endeavor.
Right. One thing we've noticed here with the homeschooling, here in the Emirates, I mean to say, where the homeschooling is relatively recent, is that although the children may not achieve academic parity with the state school children, they do keep very nice manners, and they do seem to be basically happy children, you know. Whereas I know, like one of my daughters, I sent her to an Arabic-speaking school, and she had a very rough time, you know. She had such a bad time, in fact, she was crying every morning. So I took her out, you know. She was being bullied and so forth, you know.
Sure.
So she wasn't happy. So the happiness of the children is surely a very important thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, some would argue that the happiness might be the most critical factor, because ultimately that's what will follow them through the rest of their lives. You know, we want them to be happy. We want them to be motivated to learn. I mean, and if we can keep learning interesting in a homeschool situation, then they will definitely benefit from that. And I think that again, that's why it's important for the parent to study the child. What motivates the child? What are they interested in? You know, it's important to build upon children's interests and likes and dislikes, just to keep that learning process going, you know, so they don't shut down in terms of the acquisition of knowledge.
You may know that in the old Soviet Union, I had once a neighbor when I lived in Sweden who was Polish. You know, they had a similar communist system over all the Warsaw Pact countries. People would come round to the schools, especially for the 6 to 8-year-olds, and give them certain kinds of tests for their aptitude. He himself, he was a musician. He was asked to clap to a rhythm and sing some notes, which the man played on the piano. And he was found to have a very good aptitude and was sent to this Leningrad conservatory as a pianist, you know, and became like a classical pianist for a while until his drinking brought him down, you know, like so many Soviets. But that system perhaps could be used for Muslims, that you try and find out the character of the child. And some children are good with money, some like books, some like to talk, some are mechanical.
Right. I think that's important. There's a philosophy that's being developed in America called a talent development approach to education, and that's the focus, is to try to develop each child to their fullest potential. Not that they're going to go back at 6 or 8 years old and try to push them in a particular direction. I happen to think that's a little too early, because I don't think that the tests are reliable enough to make that kind of prediction. However, what we can do is try to create a situation where those talents can emerge over time. So you see children's linguistic talents develop because they're being exposed to foreign languages. You know that they can write well because they're being exposed to writing in the curriculum. You know that they have mathematical abilities because they're exposed to higher level.
Whose responsibility should this be, the teachers or the parents?
Well, I think it has to be a combination. I think it has to be a combination. If, in fact, there's going to be a homeschooling situation, then that parent obviously is going to feel that sense of responsibility. But again, they may feel overwhelmed because of the increasing demands that are going to be made in terms of what they teach their children. And that's why the homeschool networks are so important, getting in contact with other people that are homeschooling. Now, if we're talking about a school situation, then obviously it's got to be a partnership between the parents and the school. The school, you know, again, if it's an Islamic school, they've got to see that it's their responsibility to, you know, promote the I don't even want to call them secular subjects, but that's typically what they're called, the math, the science, etc. But also provide those children with a sound Islamic education background.
Yes. It's strange to see that, for example, when I was in the Philippines some years ago with Dr. Bilal Phillips, we visited a university, this Islamic university, that had exactly that program. It had compulsory Quran or Hadith or some Islamic history subjects that had to be taken along with the criminology or accounting or whatever it was. And it was notable that the Catholic Church, who were the main power there, attacked that school much more than the Islamic madrasas that were just teaching, memorizing Quran and Arabic language.
That's interesting.
This is almost as if they feared it.
I think probably so, because they recognize that those children would become competent not only in Islam but also the so-called secular areas. And I think this is where we've seen some success in the United States with Muslim schools that have gone on and got their state accreditation, but at the same time they have very strong programs in Islamic studies and Arabic, so they can give the children both.
Yeah, it is good, because if we look back to the so-called golden age of Islamic education, Damascus and Baghdad and Samarkand and those places, the students were well versed in both types, secular and mundane and sacred.
Well, in a sense, we look at all knowledge coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so there is nothing that is not outside of the realm of Islam, if you really look at it.
They did their mathematics and medicine with that angle,
that's right, that's right. And I think that's why, we see this movement called the Islamization of knowledge and other areas, trying to make sure that Muslim children understand that the Islamic heritage in areas like mathematics and astronomy and chemistry, there are Muslims that are rooted in the history of all of these disciplines. And I think, for Muslim children to understand that, it begins to give them a different sense of self-esteem in terms of recognizing that there is an Islamic heritage in any subject matter that you can think of.
That could be taught at home, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's an excellent website called MuslimHeritage.com. And, people can go in and find out about the Muslim heritage in virtually every discipline. And that's something, that is available to the public, So homeschool people, school teachers can get into that information, and it's critical information.
Well, a lot of Muslims have been saying in England is that it's simply not worth putting your children through the state school system because the casualty rate is so high.
People are taking that, I think, that position throughout the Muslim world in terms of Muslim minority populations, and I think even you find in some majority Muslim countries, people are having to make that choice between the homeschool situation and the school situation.
And running the risks
of
the children turning out bad. Well, unfortunately, once again, we've come to the end of the program. I'd like to thank you for your views on this homeschooling versus state schooling. Thank you also, dear viewers, for watching. We hope, inshallah, you'll join us again. Uthman Barry, your host. You've been watching Raising Children. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Like every sunrise that brings forth each day, brings new meaning, new hope, a new way. Such is the blessing bestowed upon us. Every hardship and heartache will pass. From the mountains to the deep blue sea, everything in perfect harmony. And as the stars fill the evening sky, without a sensing, life is passing by. So if you want a solution, my friend, seize this moment, this day before it ends. Turn to Him, don't you see?